G'day, I'm Dan McCarthy. We recently held a public meeting here in Cairns about the Spanish mackerel fishery that the Queensland Labor government is about to impose severe restrictions upon. The meeting was very well attended and there has been significant social media exposure on the issue. It's quite clear the state government is on the wrong side of the Spanish mackerel issue. In this highlights clip of the meeting, you will see people from across the fishing community and scientific experts expose some of the many flaws in the science and raise some serious questions that the Minister and the government need to answer. Enjoy the clip and make sure you share it.
Hi, Rob Erskine from Cairns Tackle World. Firstly, I'd like to sincerely thank everyone for attending tonight's public meeting to fight back against the Queensland Fisheries proposal to shut down or severely restrict Spanish mackerel fishing by recreational, commercial and the charter boat fishermen. While I can't attend tonight's meeting in person due to family commitments in Townsville, I need to express my concerns that fishermen are again under attack. Fishermen and associated industries have suffered decades of attacks by overseas and Australian anti-lobby groups with green agendas to stop fishing and close our fishing grounds down. The Green campaign to close the Coral Sea will still be remembered by many fishermen here tonight. We didn't lie down then and allow the government and green groups to close our fishery down, and we must stand up and fight again to save our Spanish mackerel fishery. Queensland fisheries have other species in largemouth nannygai and kin threadfin salmon next in their sights to restrict or close down. Spanish mackerel are only the beginning. You'll hear tonight from respected fishing experts, along with scientist Dr. Peter Ridd and Jeff McPherson, while we must question the science being used and how data collection on Spanish mackerel biomass we believe is flawed. Jeff has vast experience in tropical marine science and has previously been part of research in the fisheries. Fishermen have constantly been told by government science that shark numbers are endangered species and that their numbers are in decline. Yet recreational, charter and commercial fishermen report shark numbers are in plague proportions not only on our local reefs and around our islands, but in our estuaries and rivers, including in the upper freshwater sections. Sharks are even being stealing jungle perch and barramundi in the freshwater, while our very own Cairns Inlet is riddled with fish-stealing bull sharks in the deep holes. If you're to believe government science that shark numbers are in decline and endangered, why are we now including shark deprivation as having a significant impact on the Spanish mackerel fishery? Local charter, recreational and commercial fishermen along the far north Queensland coast that spend their lives on the water and encounter these constant fish losses to sharks have been hoodwinked. Shark numbers have exploded to a point some locations are now unfishable due to high losses of catch, but if you listen to government scientists and bureaucrats, they are in decline and threatened, thus needing protection. Now, Queensland Fisheries asked the same fishermen to trust them on the management of the Spanish mackerel fishery. Our Spanish mackerel season has been excellent, with plenty of good fish on the local grounds and still being caught in good numbers out of prime fishing times. Queensland Fishery asked us to trust their assessment on the closures, regardless of economic impacts to commercial fishing industry, charter boats, recreational fishing sectors, fishing tackle and boat retailers, seafood and fish and chip shops, along with many more associated independent businesses and families. Sorry, fishermen do not trust you. We will challenge the rationale of your attempts to shut us down once again. Fishermen and fishing industries have suffered 1,000 cuts by government departments and will only trust credible data, science and solutions that includes and listens to experts from within our industry. We will be fools to trust what we are dealt by bureaucrats with a green tinge that have tried to burn fishermen so many times in the past.
Where I was fishing there in Townsville was on a national park, and I used to catch the Mackerel jack. And then all of a sudden the government made the decision to ban fishing in National Park. So we led a massive protest.
In other words, if 550 tonnes of Spanish mackerel is harvested annually, stock levels should be maintained at 60% level. 2 years later, the annual harvest of 300 tonnes a year, the department confirmed that the biomass is now down to 17%, triggering a potential closure. Commercial fishers in my electorate have basically said that the fish stocks is as plentiful as it's ever been, just like the recreational fishers. Also, commercial fishers have said to me that they've had the Department of Fisheries coming up there 2 years ago and told them that fish stocks are right. It's plentiful. It's as good as it's ever been. Yet, the stock assessment, either the stock assessments are flawed or Fishery Queenslanders are bad managers and have got it that wrong that they need to compensate the commercial fishing industry, the fishers, the fish shop owners, all them that will suffer if there's going to be a closure. But I met with the minister, and he had provided this chart in a dated back, I think, to the 1920s. It went like this. I think you might have seen it, Professor Reid. You might be bringing that up tonight. And I had told him that the Spanish Mackerel Group, commercial fishers, fish and chip shop owners, have no faith in DAF's latest assessment, and they also have no faith of the change of modelling from DAF. And I've also advised the minister not to make any rash, stupid decisions and continue to consult with the industry, not their department. So, as a state member of Parliament, and I'm probably speaking on behalf of Robbie Catter MP and Nick Nabano, they can't make it here tonight. I and you are going to keep up the fight with this. Anything that is raised that comes out of this meeting, these are the things I'm going to raise in Parliament, and I just want to let you know that we will not surrender. Thank you.
What this means is we'll probably see the introduction of a substitution with imported seafood, which is where Queensland Fisheries is driving the reduction in wild-caught seafood to more imports. The commercial fishing industry will decline. Fishing families such as our ones and other mackerel fishermen and the other guys working in the Queensland fisheries will face undue pressure, mental health stress. It'll be a hard time for them. Death by 1,000 cuts, that's where we're heading for this. And this will flow onto other businesses such as diesel fitters, refrigerations, and all that. And probably the biggest thing that no one ever talks about is that knowledge will be gone and won't return. So these fishermen won't return, that knowledge of the industry won't return, and it'll be gone forever. So if they ever do bring it back up, good luck to the new entrants. So I guess the message is tell your family and friends, Spanish mackerel is off the menu, and we want a full review and a proper one, and pull it apart and make sure it's correct. So any changes they do make are the proper right ones. Thank you very much. And thanks Dan, Jeff, Peter, and the guys organising it.
I'm representing AFTA, the Australian Fishing Trade Association. We're an organisation that represents the manufacturers, the wholesalers, the retailers, and the media in the fishing industry. And by virtue of that, we engage with recreational fishers through our members each and every day. We also engage with the commercial fishers because that's where they buy their gear from as well. Over the last 2 years, AFTA has had 5 meetings with the minister and his department. Part of the problem is the input data is absolutely flawed. We have put to the minister, who over the 5 meetings is actually having a turnaround position, and the report that was supposed to have been out before Christmas is delayed and delayed and delayed. And we met last Thursday with the minister in Brisbane and his department. And our friend here, the president of the Game Fishing Association of Australia, Ian Bladen's here tonight. We've teamed up with him. We've teamed up with the Boating Industry Association and our membership to show the minister there is a force of strength behind our argument. We have put to him, as a minimum, we would accept no less than 2 fish per person and no boat limit. Now, in the communique that was released on the February meeting, they said, well, 1 shouldn't be a problem because 70% of the boats that come in have 1 fish in the boat. Well, if that's not an issue, then why put a limit? If 70% of people are only catching 1 fish, why put a limit on it? But do you know what's most important? Is going and seeing each one of those who are your local member, asking them the question, put the facts without the emotion, basically facts, recording their answers, and then reporting that back to the media. Either these people stand with you or they are against you. When I was in politics and I did 17 years down in Canberra, the one thing I learned is all politicians understand numbers. Numbers will hurt you or numbers will help you. If you assemble and go and meet these members of parliament, your local members, this is the same message we'll be delivering up and down the Queensland coast. you go and tell your local member that this is not acceptable, the best tool we have is those members of parliament going and telling that minister this is not acceptable, because the minister, and I'm not saying he may not want to listen to you, but he's going to listen to his colleagues in the party room, because if he doesn't, they'll roll him. So thank you very much for coming along. Tonight when you should be home with your families enjoying yourself, let's hope we can get some common sense to prevail, and we all want a sustainable industry, but it's how we approach it that's critically important. Daniel, team, thank you very much for having us up.
Now, for recreational fishermen, commercial fishermen, tackle shop owners, boat shops, seafood outlets, takeaways, restaurants, they all play a vital role in our local economy. They're all going to have their hands tied behind their back if Queensland Fisheries and the Labor government gets away with locking up or severely restricting our mackerel fishery. It's critical that we all stick together on this. There's so many other fishing issues where government has been able to easily play the divide and conquer method, where they can pit pros against recreational anglers. And of course, the big bad nets, as a lot of people see them, is a big factor in that. Well, with mackerel, the commercial mackerel are all caught by line. So it removes that animosity between the rec and commercial sectors, which really shouldn't be there most of the time anyway. But so it's really critical that we all stick together here, or we're all going to get knocked off the fence one at a time. So now let's just assume for a moment that the stock assessment is right, the latest one. Just assume it's right. And the multiple series, and I've taken all these words out of the stock assessments. There's assumptions, estimates, possiblies, likelies, maybes, might be's, could be's, and guesswork. If that all adds up and it's correct, and it is 17%, we just have that next slide. What's going on? What could possibly have allowed that to happen or caused that to happen? Now, the obvious ones that spring to mind are, is it mismanagement? Is it an explosion in fishing effort? Is it the failed marine parks network? Or maybe there's some major changes as to who is driving the government's policy. You can see there's a bit of a dip there, 2005. You probably all remember what happened in 2005, right? They rezoned the Great Barrier Reef. Took about 30 to 40% of our productive fishing grounds off us. A lot of the commercial guys lost 70% of their commercial fishing grounds. So, yep, guess what? They're going to have a massive reduction in take, aren't you? However, since then, and I'll show you some other slides shortly, since then the take has been very, very steady, a little bit up, a little bit down each year all the way along, even with massive restrictions on access to location. Fishing's a bit like real estate, isn't it? It's all about location. Possible causes was the failure of marine parks. Now, I'm not saying the marine park has been a failure. However, if you've got a fish stock that's crashed with 15 years of the greatest network of marine parks in the world, you've got to wonder what's going on and whether it needs to be ruled in or ruled out scientifically. The stock assessment makes particular note of the year 2001 for total recreational take. It has it there as 189 tonnes for the year 2001. If we can just go down to the next slide. This one here is from a previous stock assessment. Also talks about 2001 and the recreational take. It's breaking it down into regions. The black bits are the recreational take. You add them all up, for the same year it has over 500 tonnes of recreational take. So where in the last stock assessment, the most recent one, where the hell has 300 tonnes of recreational take gone? Good question. But obviously, if they're catching a lot less fish, your fishing effort's going up, isn't it? Once again, we're told trust the science and don't you dare ever question it. This is all the data in the stock assessment from 1911. However, what jumped out to me when I was looking at that, you can see up the top there, Queensland Commercial 1937 to 1981. Some historical data there. The next earliest date I can see is down the bottom in historical surveys, 1941. So where's all the data between 1937 and 1911 that they used to estimate what the actual biomass was? And this is all about, just remember, stock assessment and the percentages and all that's all relation to what the biomass was and what the biomass is in comparison. So how the hell did they work out what it was if they haven't got one scrap of data to within 30 years? I found it very interesting that they're looking back at the other previous stock assessments, and they're saying this magnitude of estimated recreational harvest seemed unreasonable. So they came up with a new formula to work out what the historical records showed. Now, for those of you who don't know, a peer review, from what my expert science friends tells me, is when you have other scientists look at a paper and they can assess it and give their expert opinion. Well, in this particular case, there was one peer reviewer. He was given a couple of days to do a desktop review of this Spanish mackerel stock assessment. Firstly, the reviewer rightly raises some very important questions about the stock assessment, and he specifically mentions the low steepness value used to assess the stock. They were very different values to all previous Spanish mackerel stock assessments. The assumptions used in the to estimate historical catch are uncertain and lack detail and data. Just yesterday, I was talking to Channel 7, and they asked the minister what was happening. Here's his reply. The stock assessment puts the assessment puts the stock at 17%. This assessment was supported by a scientific peer review. However, the reviewer himself, as you can see on the right-hand side there, says he's unable to support the conclusions. Every time I have read the stock assessment, I just come up with more and more questions that need to be asked. But we're constantly told, trust the science, don't you dare question it. And yet many of us are having our livelihoods or our pastimes threatened by government decisions. In this case, I believe there's more holes in it than a colander. And, we're looking down the barrel here of having significant economic impact in our region. So the minister needs to ask or answer a lot of these questions. And once again, this points to why we need an Office of Quality Assurance that Peter Ridd's been going on about for a number of years, and I wholeheartedly support that. The big question I have is, when will we ever see a government with the courage and conviction to create such an office? We are importing, as Rowan Lamison said there, we're importing about 70% of the seafood we consume as Australians. Most of it comes from aquaculture ponds overseas, as well as different areas. Now, in Indonesia, we've already started, some places in Australia have already started importing Spanish mackerel from Indonesia. In Indonesia, they take between 50 and 85,000 tonnes of Spanish mackerel. On the east coast of Queensland, we're not quite taking 500 tonnes, so half of 1,000. But in Indonesia, they're taking up to 85,000 tonnes a year. But apparently we've got to shut our fishery down, and then we can bring it from them. So if the Spanish mackerel fishery is shut down, or effectively shut down by being severely restricted, will we once again be supporting the overexploitation of fisheries elsewhere, so we can pat ourselves on the back and say what a great job we are doing in protecting the marine environment and fish stocks? Many of you will remember the lockout for the Coral Sea that happened. We had a big public meeting over at Croswell Hall. There was a lot more people than this back then. Everyone's got social media to get their information from these days, so that's okay. But you'll all remember there was a huge push from these overseas lobby groups, the Pew Foundation, WWF, the Australian Marine Conservation Foundation or Society, or whatever it is, CAFNIC, others, a whole bunch of them. They were all in their big pile on. And it was no secret that some of these organisations are the most anti-fishing organisations, the most anti-farming organisations, anti-mining, anti-dam building, anti-development. They're just pretty much anti-everything that we do and should be doing in Australia, or things that we used to do. Now, when those organisations, when that Coral Sea attack was on, those organisations were out in front of centre. They were on the front foot pushing for these mass closures. They were the ones in the media. They were the ones taking it all on. But what's happened this time with the government of the day, pretty much, and as Bob referred to earlier there, Tony Burke, or actually before Tony Burke was there, it was our good friend Peter Garrett. And he ended up getting rolled. And I think the Coral Sea issue had a bit to play in that. But anyway, This time with the Spanish mackerel fishery, things are a little bit different. We haven't got the green groups out on the front foot pushing for the closures. We haven't got them making the noise, but we are getting pretty much the same results, the same effect. We're looking at a fishery shutdown with a lot of questions to be asked about the science. There's been quite a shift. So we've got to think about what's going on, what's happened behind the scenes. And I think in the interest of transparency, we need to ask some questions to understand what's happening. So has the government policy changed? Are there different scientists involved? Or is there different data available that that just hasn't been released for us to have a look at? Or has there been changes within key staff positions of power within the department or government ministerial offices? And if so, could these people be influencing the outcomes or pushing predetermined agendas? Well, in the interest of transparency, the government needs to declare who is involved and what's changed. We have been made aware of some significant changes within very powerful positions that are of major concern. For example, the former long-term president of the WWF and the Australian Marine Conservation Society is now the Chief of Staff for the Queensland Environment Minister, Megan Scanlon. If that doesn't put shivers up your spine, it certainly raised my bristles when I heard about it. So, and another one that we are aware of is a former WWF staffer who's now the chair of the Spanish Mackerel Review. Certainly, I don't know of any other staff changes, and I don't know what influence these people are having on policy or the government's agenda. But these questions need to be answered by the minister and the government in general. We're trying to build dams in Queensland. Our economy's reliant on the mining industry, and here we are kicking its guts in every second day. And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked here. People's livelihoods are on the line, and that's why a lot of us are pretty cranked up about this. And it's got a huge impact on our entire regional economy, these government decisions. And it's vital there's transparency and full disclosure by government, and we should not accept anything less. So where to from here? Having seen this many times before, I'm concerned that a political decision will be made rather than a scientific-based decision in regard to mackerel. And there's lots of potential for this to follow to other fisheries like king salmon and nannygai, and no doubt others. Yesterday, I saw Queensland Fisheries review saying that the king salmon in the Gulf of Carpentaria is down to 5%. If that's anywhere near accurate, are we looking at a grossly mismanaged fishery by Queensland Fisheries, or are we looking at questionable science? I suggest we need considerable investigation on that. I'm not going to go through the nannygai one, but there was just one paragraph that really jumped out at me. There was 21 model scenarios done that had the stock ranging from 13 to 73%. So they decided that it was 23%. They want to take the total take from around 494 tonnes to 12 tonnes across commercial, recreational and Indigenous take. So from nearly 500 tonnes to 12 tonnes on the back of modelling that ranges from 13 to 73%. I think we've got a major issue here, guys, and we need to push back. We need to let all these local members know. We need to let the minister know we're not happy, and we're not going to take this lying down. The only way we can really push ahead with this, there's a lot of these other places are asking for meetings, and I've been doing a bit of homework, and I had a really good look at the marginal seats up and down the coast. The Labor government's got 13 seats they hold under 5%. They've got 8 seats they hold under 3%. And they all just happen to be in mackerel hotspots.
In terms of reproduction, I guess I hope many of you would recognise what we used to call sago rogue, hydrated oocytes or ovaries, and that's where you know that fish is going to spawn that night. The other way of tagging aging or doing a reproduction on a fish is to look at the follicles that are left over. Just like in mammals, the egg goes, there's a follicle left, and it remains for about 18 hours. And we can use these two methods to work out how many times Spanish mackerel are spawning on an aggregation. And the figure is usually between 2 to about 5 days, and it depends on the size of the fish. The bigger fish will spawn more often. After spawning, the eggs, then the larvae, all must develop inshore. no development out in the reef waters, all inshore, and the timing is such that it usually coincides with a cyclone runoff, productivity and the like. The interesting thing is that working with Rowan's family company and the Japanese, we found that actually when the tuna was spawning in the Coral Sea was an indication of 1 month later the mackerel would start spawning. Main spawning really, is, as you're aware, is between Townsville and Cairns. Spawning does occur to the north and south, but it's probably a bit arbitrary because even if the spawning occurred, the development capability for the larvae would be fairly low. Now, I should also say we're looking at the east coast. There's a long north-south latitude. So after spawning, all the fish that moved south were all going in the middle of the steamer track. Basically, the distance they travelled, 50% of it was they had a tailwind, well, actually a tail current. So that made it actually energetically worthwhile. The bigger fish went into further south, cooler water, which is a classic tunerism. The bigger they get, they've got to control their metabolism. They always go to deeper and cooler areas. Then when it really gets cold, around about Anzac Day down south, the southeast is picking up and blowing the water north. The fish are all on those currents and then moving back. And what you find is the rate of movement. We didn't get any tag returns, but the rate of movement is in that top graph up there, which is basically fishboard sails moving up the coast with the migration. A little bit after that, then the Hales ferries were replaced with much faster ones, much noisier, louder. And what we found, the fishermen noticed this, and they noticed the gold spot herring over at Fitzroy suddenly just disappeared. Now that was interesting to me because a few months before and a few months after, I did a stock assessment, a bait fish survey with the South Pacific Commission. So we had before and after, and boy, was there a difference. But the best, now I wouldn't suggest to anyone that they do that these days, but one young fella 42 years ago, himself, quite a few others, just before the bite at Green Island, we rafted a couple of boats together and we jumped in the water. And we could see the mackerel. I'm not sure if you're with me on that particular one. You'd be silly if you did. But we could see the fish swimming by, and we could see them making this, people might have seen this, it appears like a cough movement. I don't know if you've ever seen that with tunas. Mackerel's a tuna. They make this cough. Now, I don't know if they've got a cold, and I don't know if it's exactly like that, but it's this, or even a vomit effect. But what we did notice is when these big boats arrived, the fish that were just swimming in a group just suddenly turned and swerved and went all over the place. And the divers that were doing some work down on the face of Green Island noticed exactly the same thing. We noticed this mentioned to fisheries, to Gabrumpa. No one took any notice. But by the early 2000s, we knew exactly what it was. We could link the disruption of the schools to acoustics. I think I'll go to the next slide. Academics were saying 2018 they had shark control data, and they were saying whalers were down 64%, tigers 71%, hammerheads 92%. This is dreadful, and we need to save more sharks. Okay, but the funny thing about it is Queensland Shark Control Program accounts for 0.5% of all the Queensland coast within the Great Barrier Reef area. Now, to sort of multiply out something up 200 times, somebody in grade first year high school wouldn't be allowed to get away with that. But these academics get away with it. Unreal. And the other minor thing is that the shark control gear is, I worked in shark control for 16 years, by the way, 400 metres offshore. Does Queensland go offshore 400 metres? Just a tad more in some places than others? That's the volume of water. So this gives you an idea of the predictability of it. Yep. So we look at some of their data. First of all, with nets. There's two, you can see that up until the early 90s, and then suddenly it plummets. And they're saying, well, tiger sharks are off the planet. And we're looking at shark control data, but that's an indication of what's happening. See, in the red box, we started off on whale alarms to reduce whales running into nets. The ones we bought from Canada until I made new ones for the first 5 years, it turns out the sharks could hear. So the acoustic alarms are working really well for whales, keeping them out of nets, but they work really well for keeping the sharks out too, which is not quite what the shark control program was about. But it's an indication of how good the acoustics work. So I made a new one about mid-period, and then this idiot shark control manager that we had, not telling anyone, bought a new dolphin alarm to keep dolphins out of net. The only problem was it made a sound that the sharks could hear. And so the catch is going down even more. Yeah, it's getting better, guys. It's getting better. Next one. So here we've got drum lines. They're the same sort of thing. But what they knew about is the reason for this is that dolphins were taking baits off the drum lines. Now, there's a funny thing that you guys as fishermen understand, but academics obviously don't. No bait, no catch. I worked in fisheries at a time when we had these really well looked after sustainable shark fisheries. They've just been basically wiped out. The juveniles of the sharks that were caught in those fisheries are now growing up, and they're getting bigger, and they're giving you guys a real hard time out there. Really well managed shark fisheries is really what we need, and I think we've got to go back to that sort of stage.
Essentially what you've got is a new report with new data, in inverted commas, supposedly going back to 1911 or 1912. And when you look at that data, you think, how on earth did they dream up this data from 1911 to 1941 when the fish board started, or whatever the date was, because it looks very, very suspicious. And then you got to wonder, well, how good is the data from 1941 to the 1970s? Well, we didn't really know much about the fishing effort that was going on there. It's got very large error bars, so there's more data of dubious quality that's in there. But most of all, what's ended up happening with this new report is they've got themselves a new model, and the model is just a calculation with a whole lot of parameters that you can change the values of. And they've adjusted those parameters so that suddenly we go from a fishing stock rate of 40% or whatever they claimed a few years ago, and suddenly it's dropped below apparently 20%. Now, one of the most important parameters in that model is this thing called the steepness parameter. We won't go into the detail, but essentially in the peer reviewer of the model reckons that the normal value you'd use for this would be 0.65 or 0.6. But the people who did the stock assessment in the report reckon the value is 0.3 or 0.45 or something. The number doesn't matter too much. But it makes a huge difference on what you then calculate the number of mackerel are out there. It makes a factor of 3 difference. So you go from about 17% to about 60%. Now, in the same assessment, they're saying, well, we might have to close the fishery to bring it back from 17% up to where we want to be, which happens to be about 60%. But all they have to do is change the value on the model, and they're back at 60% anyway. All right. So the normal value that would be used in these models would give you a value of about 60%. In other words, a very healthy mackerel fishery, which is what we seem to be. But by changing that value, we artificially pretend that the value is much lower than it actually is. So there are huge problems here with the way that this report has been done. And in the end, this is fundamentally an issue of the quality assurance of the science that we're supposedly using. Now, let me just ask you guys a question. I wouldn't mind a show of hands. Would you guys accept if this work was done in a properly quality assured way, that you would accept the result of it? Hands up if you would accept if it was done in right. So essentially virtually everybody. And then of course that's obvious. But the problem is that we're not getting good quality assured science in this report. But it turned out that in this case, the peer reviewer actually said he disagreed with the main conclusion of the report, as Dan said, right? So we've got the report, we've got the peer reviewer who states very explicitly that he disagrees with the stock assessment. And then we have the minister come along just yesterday and say, oh, it's been peer reviewed. But he failed to mention that the peer review disagreed with the actual conclusion of the report. So that's a shocking situation that's happened. I don't know whether the minister's actually ever read the peer review, but he's certainly been misled by somebody if he hasn't. If we look at the Great Barrier Reef, which I've got a sort of a bigger interest in, a lot of the stuff which claims damage to the Great Barrier Reef is just appalling science. I won't call it science because it's not science, because it hasn't been done properly. So, for example, I spent, more than most of a career looking at sediment on the Great Barrier Reef, right? So we invented the instruments for measuring sediment concentrations out on the reefs for long periods of time. We had more measurements than any other people of what the sediment concentrations were, and we were able to demonstrate that the stuff coming from farms wasn't getting out to the reef. Yes, it gets into Trinity Bay, and Trinity Bay blows up and goes muddy every time there's a southeaster, but it's done that since eternity. It's always been like that. By the time you get out onto the reef, there's minuscule amounts of sediment from farms. So we were able to demonstrate that again and again and again. Other scientists have been able to demonstrate it again and again. But in the major reports on the reef, coming out of Gabrumpa and AIMS and various other organisations, they still claim that somehow this sediment is causing damage to the reef. So there we have a major quality assurance problem that's affecting, in that case, the farmers, right? That's not your problem, but it's the same fundamental problem of poor quality assured science, making stuff up essentially, which then ultimately affects real people, doing real jobs and feeding the population. I could talk more about that. So, for example, pesticides. Supposedly the pesticides coming off farms is damaging the reef. But when you actually go out onto the reef and you take a water bottle sample and then you run that through the most sensitive scientific equipment to try to measure the pesticides levels, they're in such low concentrations that they cannot even be measured. You're talking about concentrations in some cases down to parts per billion, and you can't measure it. And yet farmers are blamed for killing the Great Barrier Reef. Or a crazy one, I just mentioned this, it's very different to the fishing thing, but supposedly coal dust blowing off the coal loading facilities down at Hay Point is damaging the Great Barrier Reef. It turned out that this paper that supposedly said this had a 3,000% error in it, right? Now, we've pointed this out to the organisation that produced it. The wrong information has been sent to a Senate inquiry. It's reported in all the big reports on the Great Barrier Reef. Just last year, it was reported in the quasi-United Nations report on the reef that coal dust was actually damaging the reef. And yet there's a 3,000% error in there, and none of the institutions will do anything about this to remove this dodgy information. They know it is wrong. We've ultimately got a quality assurance problem, and that the only way we're going to solve this is to get proper audits done on a whole lot of this science. So I'll ask you for a hands up again, who supports quality assurance of the science and a proper audit of this report?
Hopefully this clip has given you a bit more of an insight on the realities we face as a fishing community. If you love your mackerel fishing, or just love your fishing in general, the best thing you can do is contact your local MP, regardless of which political party they belong to, and make sure they understand how cranky you are about the proposed restrictions. Contact the Premier's office, contact the Leader of the Opposition's office, contact the Fisheries Minister Mark Furness' office and tell him you're not happy and you will not cop the Spanish mackerel restrictions. It's vital we stick together and stand up against this attack on our fishing access, or we're going to lose it. Make sure you make a submission and make your objections heard. Keep your eyes out for the mackerel trucks that are rolling out around the state right now, and make sure you share this video.